Jamal Washington adjusted his backpack straps as he walked through the front doors of Westfield High School for the first time. The October morning air was crisp, and the unfamiliar hallways buzzed with the energy of students catching up after weekend adventures. At 17, Jamal had moved schools more times than most kids his age, thanks to his father's military career. But this transition felt different. This was supposed to be permanent. His dad had finally retired, and they'd settled in the suburban town of Millbrook, hoping for stability in Jamal's senior year. The guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, had given him a tour the previous week, pointing out the usual landmarks: cafeteria, library, gym, main office. What she hadn't prepared him for was the social geography, the invisible territories that every high school contained. As Jamal navigated toward his first period AP Physics class, he could feel eyes following him, the subtle shift in conversation that happened when someone new entered an established ecosystem. Westfield High was different from the diverse military-based schools he'd attended previously. Here, in this affluent suburb, Jamal stood out in ways that had nothing to do with being the new student. He was one of perhaps a dozen black students in a school of nearly 2,000, and his presence seemed to create ripples of curiosity and assumption that followed him down the hallway like an invisible wake. "Fresh meat," he heard someone whisper as he passed a cluster of students near the lockers. The comment was followed by laughter that had an edge to it, the kind that suggested entertainment at someone else's expense. Jamal had learned long ago not to react to such comments. In his experience, bullies were like predators in the wild. They could sense fear and uncertainty, and they fed on reactions. Better to move through their environment with quiet confidence, neither challenging nor cowering, until he could assess the landscape properly. His first 3 classes passed without incident. AP Physics, where he was pleasantly surprised to find the material familiar and engaging. British Literature, where the teacher, Mr. Hensley, seemed genuinely pleased to have a student who'd actually read the assigned material. And AP Calculus, where he quietly solved problems on the board that had stumped several other students, earning curious glances and whispered speculation about the new kid. It was during lunch that Jamal encountered the school's resident power structure. The cafeteria was a symphony of social stratification: athletes at their traditional tables, theater kids clustered near the windows, academic achievers scattered throughout in small, intense groups discussing homework and college applications. Jamal purchased his lunch and scanned for an empty table, finally settling at a spot near the back where he could observe without drawing attention. He'd barely taken his first bite when 3 students approached his table. The leader was clearly Brad Morrison, a name Jamal had already heard whispered in the hallways with a mixture of respect and fear. Brad was everything Central Casting would order for a high school antagonist: 6 feet tall, broad shoulders from 4 years of varsity football, perfectly styled blonde hair, and the kind of confident swagger that came from never having his assumptions challenged. Flanking Brad were his usual companions: Tyler Chen, whose family's wealth had bought him acceptance despite his naturally quiet demeanor, and Marcus Rodriguez, who seemed to have chosen loyalty to Brad over solidarity with other students who might have understood what it felt like to be different in Westfield's predominantly white environment. Well, Brad said, sliding uninvited into the seat across from Jamal. "The new guy. I'm Brad Morrison. My family's been in Millbrook for 4 generations. My dad owns Morrison Construction, probably built half the houses in this town." Jamal looked up from his sandwich, meeting Brad's eyes calmly. "Nice to meet you, Brad. I'm Jamal Washington." "Washington," Brad repeated, as if testing the name. "Like the president? That's ironic." His companions snickered at what they apparently considered wit. "Actually," Jamal said mildly, "like the chess grandmaster. My father named me after Jamal Washington, one of the youngest masters to ever win the U.S. championship." The reference sailed over Brad's head, but Jamal noticed Tyler's slight frown of recognition. "Interesting. Chess, huh?" Brad leaned back in his chair, his posture radiating casual dominance. "That's cute. Kind of a nerdy game, don't you think? Here at Westfield, we're more about real competition: football, basketball, wrestling, sports that matter. Different kinds of competition require different kinds of intelligence," Jamal replied, taking another bite of his sandwich. "But I suppose not everyone appreciates strategic thinking." The comment was mild, but Brad's expression sharpened. He wasn't accustomed to responses that didn't show proper deference to his assumed authority. "Strategic thinking," Brad repeated mockingly. "Listen, new guy, let me give you some strategic thinking. This is how things work at Westfield. There's a social order here, and everyone has their place. The sooner you figure out where you fit, the easier your senior year is going to be." Jamal set down his sandwich and looked directly at Brad. And where exactly do you think I fit? The question was asked with genuine curiosity, but Brad heard it as a challenge. His face flushed slightly, and Jamal could see the anger building behind his eyes. I think you fit wherever I say you fit, Brad said, his voice losing its casual tone and taking on something harder. See, my family's been running things in this town since before your family probably even knew this place existed. My dad sits on the school board. My uncle's the police chief. My grandfather was the mayor for 16 years. He leaned forward, lowering his voice so only their table could hear. So when I give you advice about knowing your place, you might want to listen. The threat was clear, wrapped in the kind of institutional power that Brad had probably wielded his entire life. Jamal could see how this scenario usually played out. New student, especially one who looked different, would be intimidated by the display of local authority and would acquiesce to whatever social position Brad deemed appropriate. But Jamal Washington had lived on military bases around the world. He'd attended schools in Germany, Japan, and South Korea. He'd seen real power, had conversations with generals and diplomats, had witnessed his father navigate complex international situations with intelligence and dignity. Brad Morrison's small-town power structure wasn't impressive, it was provincial. That's fascinating, Jamal said, his tone remaining conversational. So what you're telling me is that your family's local influence is your primary source of identity and authority. You derive your sense of self-worth from accomplishments that happened before you were born, achieved by people other than yourself. Tyler shifted uncomfortably, and even Marcus looked uncertain. Brad's face was turning a deeper shade of red. What did you just say to me? I said it's fascinating how some people need to borrow significance from their family history because they haven't accomplished anything notable themselves. It's actually a pretty common psychological phenomenon, vicarious achievement as a substitute for personal development. The words were delivered with the same mild tone Jamal had been using throughout the conversation, but their impact was devastating. Brad had probably never had his fundamental source of identity analyzed and dismissed so casually. You think you're smart, Brad said, standing up abruptly. His voice was loud enough now that nearby tables were starting to pay attention. You think because you can use big words, that makes you better than us? Jamal remained seated, looking up at Brad with genuine interest. I don't think intelligence makes anyone better than anyone else. But I do think that intelligence, combined with character, tends to produce better outcomes than relying on inherited privilege and intimidation. The cafeteria was quieting down as students sensed confrontation brewing. Brad's fists were clenched at his sides, and Jamal could see the internal struggle, the desire to respond with violence warring against the awareness that they were in public, surrounded by witnesses and potential consequences. You know what? Brad said, making his decision. I think you need to learn some respect. Tyler, Marcus, I think our new friend here needs a lesson in how things work at Westfield. The two followers stood up reluctantly. Tyler looked actively uncomfortable, while Marcus seemed torn between loyalty and an obvious recognition that this was escalating beyond reasonable bounds. Jamal finally stood as well, but his posture remained relaxed. Brad, before you make a decision you might regret, can I ask you something? What? Do you play chess? The question was so unexpected that Brad actually paused. What kind of stupid question is that? It's not stupid at all. See, chess is really about pattern recognition and strategic thinking. A good chess player learns to think several moves ahead, to anticipate consequences, to understand how current actions will play out over time. Jamal pulled out his phone and opened an app. For instance, right now, you're thinking about intimidating me physically. You're probably assuming that because you're bigger, because you have your friends with you, because you think you have home field advantage, that you hold all the power in this situation. He held up his phone, showing that he'd been recording their entire conversation. But a chess player would have noticed that I started recording as soon as you sat down. A chess player would have realized that everything you've said, the threats, the references to your family's power, the obvious intimidation tactics, it's all been captured in high-definition audio. Brad's face went pale as the implications began to dawn on him. Now, a chess player would also have noticed that our conversation has attracted quite a bit of attention. See Mrs. Rodriguez over there by the faculty table? She's been watching us for the past 5 minutes. And Mr. Patterson, the vice principal? He started walking this way about 30 seconds ago. Jamal pocketed his phone and smiled. But here's the really interesting part, Brad. A chess player would have done some research before making his first move. He would have learned, for instance, that the new student's father isn't just any retired military officer. He would have discovered that Colonel James Washington served as a military liaison to the Pentagon, that he has connections throughout the Department of Defense, and that he's been personally decorated by 3 different presidents. Brad's confident posture was crumbling as Jamal continued. A chess player would also have researched the new student himself. He might have discovered that Jamal Washington has never lost a chess tournament in any school he's attended. He might have learned that Jamal was personally tutored by grandmasters during his father's diplomatic postings. He might have realized that someone with that kind of strategic training would never enter a confrontation without having already planned several moves ahead. Tyler was backing away from the table, clearly wanting no part of whatever was coming next. Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. But most importantly, Jamal said, his voice still calm but carrying new authority. A chess player would have understood that the real power in this situation wasn't inherited wealth or local family connections. The real power belonged to whoever was smart enough to control the narrative. Mr. Patterson had reached their table, his expression serious. Is everything all right here, gentlemen? Actually, Mr. Patterson, Jamal said, turning to face the vice principal. Brad here was just welcoming me to Westfield. He was telling me about his family's long history in the community and explaining how the social dynamics work here. I found it quite educational. The vice principal looked between the students, clearly sensing tension but unable to identify exactly what had transpired. Brad, is that accurate? Brad opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing that any complaint he made would require explaining the context that had been recorded on Jamal's phone. Yeah, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, just welcoming the new student. Excellent, Mr. Patterson said. I'm glad to see our students making newcomers feel welcome. Jamal, how are you settling in? Very well, thank you. Everyone's been quite helpful in explaining how things work here. After the vice principal moved on, Brad looked at Jamal with something approaching desperation. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that he seemed unsure how to proceed. What do you want? Brad asked quietly. Jamal considered the question seriously. I want to finish my senior year without unnecessary drama. I want to focus on my studies and my college applications. I want to be treated with the same basic respect that I show to others. He paused, studying Brad's face. What I don't want is to have to use this recording or make phone calls to people who might be very interested in how the grandson of a longtime mayor and son of a school board member treats new students. But whether I have to do those things depends entirely on choices you make going forward. Brad nodded slowly, understanding the terms being offered. Good, Jamal said, sitting back down to finish his lunch. Now, Tyler, I noticed your reaction when I mentioned chess earlier. Do you play? Tyler, still looking shell-shocked by the rapid reversal of fortune, nodded. A little. I'm in the chess club. Excellent. Maybe you could show me where they meet. I'd love to get involved. As the 3 would-be bullies walked away from the table, their confident swagger replaced by confused uncertainty, Jamal reflected on the encounter. He'd learned long ago that the best victories were the ones that didn't require fighting, that intelligence and preparation could often accomplish more than force or intimidation. The rest of his lunch period passed peacefully. Several students approached his table, some offering genuine welcomes, others clearly curious about what they'd witnessed. Word was already spreading through the school's social networks that the new student wasn't going to be an easy target, that assumptions about him had been dramatically wrong. By the end of the day, Jamal had been invited to join the chess club, the debate team, and the academic bowl squad. Teachers had begun seeking him out, curious about his background and impressed by his performance in advanced classes. He'd made tentative connections with several students who seemed genuinely interested in friendship rather than social positioning. Most importantly, Brad Morrison and his followers had given him a wide berth, their earlier aggression replaced by wary respect. They'd learned what military strategists had known for centuries, that true power came not from the ability to intimidate, but from the wisdom to understand when and how to use whatever advantages you possessed. 3 weeks later, Jamal had settled comfortably into Westfield's social ecosystem. He'd joined several clubs, earned the respect of his teachers, and built genuine friendships with students who appreciated intelligence and character over social pedigree. The chess club had elected him captain after he'd defeated every member, including the previous year's state champion, in casual games that had drawn crowds of amazed spectators. Brad Morrison had kept his distance, but the encounter seemed to have affected him in unexpected ways. Rather than harboring resentment, he'd begun approaching conflicts differently, thinking before acting, considering consequences beyond immediate gratification. His grades had improved, and several teachers had commented on his more mature classroom behavior. Tyler Chen had become one of Jamal's closest friends, their shared love of strategic thinking creating a bond that transcended the social boundaries that had previously defined their school experience. Through Tyler, Jamal had met other students who'd felt marginalized by Westfield's traditional hierarchies, and together they'd begun to shift the school's social dynamics towards something more inclusive and intellectually focused. The story of that first-day confrontation had become legendary at Westfield, told and retold as an example of how intelligence and preparation could triumph over intimidation and inherited privilege. But for Jamal, the real victory hadn't been in outmaneuvering Brad Morrison. It had been in demonstrating that strength came in many forms, and that the most powerful weapon in any conflict was often the ability to think clearly under pressure. Years later, when Jamal was attending MIT on a full scholarship and Brad was struggling through community college, they would occasionally reflect on that October afternoon when their paths had first crossed. Both would acknowledge that the encounter had changed them. Jamal had learned to trust in his own intelligence and character, while Brad had learned that true respect couldn't be inherited or demanded, only earned through one's own actions and choices. The chess master's gambit had succeeded not because it had defeated an enemy, but because it had transformed a potential adversary into someone capable of growth and self-reflection, and in the end, that was perhaps the most elegant victory of all.